Welcome to the Global Marketing Show, the podcast for all things international business. I'm your host, Wendy Pease, president of Rapport International and a translation expert. Come along with me today as we talk to an expert in the global marketing world about facing their biggest fears, hearing about mistakes they made or saw, discussing best practices, and sharing fun travel, language, and culture stories. Hi, listeners of the Global Marketing Show. Thank you for tuning in again to another episode. As you know, the Global Marketing Show is brought to you by Rapport International. I have a tidbit for you today that is based on cheese, and it has something to do with France because as we're recording this, the Olympics are going on right now. So it just seemed perfect since our guest is going to talk to us about AgTech, and who doesn't love cheese? So did you know that there's 450 types of cheeses in the world? I had no idea.
Wow.
I think I've sampled at least 100 of them, and that 250 of them come from France. So I'm going to do a social media post about the village eating where the Olympic athletes are. It's no longer called cafeterias, they're called restaurants because it is in France and cheese comes from France. So speaking of agriculture, today we're welcoming Andrew Jason, and he's a dynamic leader with a passion for bringing people together, which is perfect for his role. He's fostering innovation through collaboration. His career has been marked by a commitment to creating impactful connections and building ecosystems. So if you're in farming and you're in tech and you're interested in those areas, stay tuned because he is the Grand Farm Ecosystem Director, and he has developed a global network of corporations, startups, growers, educational institutions, researchers, and government entities, which is amazing to make all those connections. I'm a connector and I'm impressed. His innovative approach has led to the successful execution of large-scale conferences, growth of Grand Farm, and expansion into new regions. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for having me. And let's do that trip and sample those 250 cheeses sometime.
For that. Très bien. So tell me about Grand Farm in this community that you're building and why it got started.
Yeah, happy to. So maybe I'll take you through a little bit about the history of Grand Farm, kind of where we were born out of, and ultimately some of the challenges that we set out to solve. So Grand Farm was kind of the birth child of an organization called Emerging Prairie, which has existed for about 12 years. We're based here in Fargo, North Dakota. And ultimately, what we were focused on was supporting out and connecting this entrepreneurial ecosystem with the thesis that entrepreneurs need access to capital, customers, and other entrepreneurs. And so we hosted a number of different events, programs, things like that. And at one of them, a longtime kind of intrepid entrepreneur by the name of Barry Batchelor gave a talk. And he basically challenged us to think about what's our major, all around the thesis that every community needs to put a flag in the ground and say, this is what we are going to be world-class leaders at. And if you look at kind of the Silicon Valley story on how success was begat upon success, he basically went back and described how those that don't know about Fargo would be surprised by kind of the entrepreneurial spirit here. So if you go back to the late 1800s, this was the region where the bonanza farms were created, which were these farms that were about 100,000 acres in the late 1800s and used really innovative technology for the time. This is where Bobcat was founded by a turkey farmer that got tired of shoveling out manure from his barn. So he put together the first skid steer. This is where one of the first computer chips was put on the first tractor. So there's a really long-standing history of ag innovation. And that's kind of ultimately where Grand Farm got started, was we can be world-class leaders in agriculture. And then ultimately, so we're about 5 years old, and we are set up as a 501c3 nonprofit. And ultimately, our goal is to create a global ecosystem around innovation in agriculture. And ultimately, what we want to do is we want to develop these kind of regional ecosystems where we can identify challenges that the local growers, ag industry, educational groups that they're facing. And then we have this global ecosystem of technology that we can pull in solutions from anywhere in the world. So ultimately, if a farmer down in Georgia is facing challenges around herbicide resistant weeds, we can identify, hey, there's this startup out of Japan that is tackling this, and then ultimately drive towards collaboration to solve those challenges.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. You said what we want to do, but you've already made major strides. Can you talk to me about what you already have open and running and the global partnerships that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Our most robust regional ecosystem, I guess you could say, is here in North Dakota. We call this our upper Midwest ecosystem. And kind of what we have here is we have a 600-acre farm that we call our innovation campus. So on 300 acres, precision planting runs Precision Technical Institute in North Dakota, where they're using it to kind of farm and look at different practices to share with growers. On our 300 acres, we basically do test plots with our partners, startups, and researchers from kind of around the world. So this year out at our farm, we have 31 test plots from 18 different organizations. We have a startup from Canada. We have a startup from Costa Rica. So there is kind of international reach. And then here, we also just opened up our 25,000 square foot innovation shop to bring that ecosystem together. We've expanded now into new markets. So we are launching a Southeast regional ecosystem in partnership with the University of Georgia. So we have 250 acres in Perry, Georgia, that we're establishing kind of this innovation campus. That's going to be the University of Georgia Grand Farm. And then we are going to be launching a mountain region in Bozeman, Montana, in partner with the Headwaters Tech Hub there. That'll be going online in the next year or so. And then, we are also really excited about the international market and their opportunities. So we just announced a partnership with Deep Valley out of Fukuoka City, Japan. They're developing a kind of a robust ag ecosystem for Japan. So we're kind of creating links and nodes where we can engage with their startups, or they can engage with our startups to drive collaboration. And we just got an email this morning that we sent them a US startup that now just visited the city, is doing testing and trials with some different startups and farmers there. So that's what this is all about.
This is so fascinating. Next, I want to ask you about tech and agriculture and the marrying of those together. So it's because it's such a fascinating area, but I have to tell you a little story. When I was in high school, my dad was a professor at the Penn State University, and he had a storage facility at a place called Black Moshannon, and he had figured out how to use technology. And this is back in the late 70s, early 80s, that if there was any problem with the storage facility, it would call our home number. So I was middle school, early teenager, high school or something like that. And I had just gotten a phone in my room. I was so excited. And so any time of day or night, if the phone answered, I'd ring it. One night at 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings, I answered it, and there's this mechanical voice. There was a power outage at Black Moshannon. Where he stored the potatoes. He's since passed. It's been over 20 years now, but I just think about how excited he would be about the technology in agriculture. So I would love to hear from you as where you're seeing that going and how your innovation center is putting that together.
Yeah, well, I think first off, kind of your point to your story is one of the things from the general public that I think needs to change, as I always kind of talk about, there needs to be like a rebrand of agriculture to the general public, right? A lot of people still think of, oh man, now I'm blanking on the name of the painting, but the old man and his wife standing in the field with a pitchfork looking very stoic. And that is not at all the state of agriculture anymore. These farms, many of them are multi-million-dollar businesses and operations. And some of the most innovative people I know are farmers. So there is a lot of technology that's being adopted and created in agriculture. I think ultimately kind of high level, some of the ones that we see a lot and work with a lot is, sustainability is a buzzword in agriculture, but there's a lot of truth to that. With climate change, there's a lot of environmental challenges that we're facing, whether that's drought, excess water, flooding, runoff of chemicals, pesticides, things like that. So you're seeing a lot more of a focus on sustainability. And so a lot of those revolve around like input. So what are different use cases for fertilizer, or how do you decrease your fertilizer usage, or how do you look at biological solutions rather than chemical fertilizers? That's a big one. The other one is data collection in agriculture is a really important one. So if you think about the amount of data that could be collected in agriculture, it's pretty overwhelming. If you look at a field or a farmer that has 1,000 acres, you know, a lot of those farms or their individual fields could be 100-acre size plots. You put one sensor in there, you're collecting data for 100 acres, which is really broad. You put 10 sensors in there, and then ultimately kind of where it's going to be going with more and more advanced technology, artificial intelligence, increased connectivity, is you're going to be seeing per plant analysis, where a farmer can go in, do a drone flight over it, identify, all right, there's weeds here, here, and here, and they can go out and do basically spot applications to tackle those individual weeds. The one that's kind of always, I call it the sexy one, is robotics. Everybody's got the vision of the autonomous robots going out and doing spraying or weeding. Drones are obviously a really large case in agriculture. So those would be some of the high level kind of technology use cases that we see.
So you've got the farmers and the ag and the research going on. And I think you had mentioned that a lot of the tech that's going on could be in other countries. And so in those three areas, where are you seeing the hot spots for the tech developing, and how do you find them and bring them together?
I definitely think that there's different regions of the world that has a lot of kind of ag innovation. And then there's a lot of regions of the world where there's a lot of opportunities to bring ag innovation, right? Where it's more subsistence farming. Some of the kind of the spots that we're seeing a lot of technology from is Brazil is quickly becoming a powerhouse in the ag industry. I think they overtook the US in soybean production this year. I want to double check that before you state that as God's truth. But they're seeing a lot of innovation that's coming from there. Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world that we've heard. They're a large fertilizer market, so that has created a lot of global disruptions. Europe, there is a lot of innovation that's happening there, and then a lot of the regulatory pressures that you're seeing through the EU. So they have a lot stricter environmental standards that are being passed down through the EU. And I think you probably heard about some of the kind of uprisings in France from the local farmers. Australia has a pretty robust ecosystem. Japan is growing one, like I mentioned. Canada is obviously a very strong one. So.
Okay, and so your vision is to pull the hot technology into whatever crops at the centers you're working on?
Yeah, exactly. And so ultimately, you can kind of think of us as we want to do two things. We want to develop these regional ecosystems. So let's say, imagine this farm that we're launching down in Georgia. So we're thinking about that as kind of the southeast part of the United States. And ultimately, what we want to do is we want to develop these relationships with growers, ag industry, researchers, school groups, things like that, to create engagement and facilitate connections around what's happening in agriculture and ag tech, identify the pain points that they're facing. So we could produce a grower pain point report that you can find on our website. And then from the actual physical farm, that is going to be where we can deploy test plots. We can do events and programs, bring people actually out in a physical environment. And then, so we have our regional ecosystem, and then this global innovation ecosystem, that is where we can pull in technology from anywhere in the world. So that's like this startup from Japan is relevant for peaches. So we bring them into Georgia.
And which is absolutely fascinating to bring. I mean, I lived on an international ag research center funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in Mexico, and I lived in two others, and I lived in one in the Philippines and then in Taiwan. And so the research centers, I have seen those going on, but I don't know what they're doing now with the technology. So that's another area that I can connect you into if you're interested. Because they're thriving all over the United States, and they specialize on different crops. So what you're talking about is you're bringing all sorts of different cultures together. I mean, if you just focused in the US, you talk about growers versus industry versus researchers versus education. They all have their own culture and way of looking at things. And then you're going to overlap the international. What are your biggest challenges so far at Grand Farm for growing?
Yeah, that's a great question. One, it's appropriate growth, right? So we don't want to grow too quick. We just launched a farm in Georgia. We're launching one now in Montana. There was like 3 of us on the team. Now we have kind of 42 across the supporting organizations and things like that. So there's been a lot of growth over 5 years. So the appropriate amount of growth, we don't want to grow too quick and, go internationally. And then the other one that I'm kind of realizing as we're expanding into new markets is kind of my original thinking was like, right, we've established this really robust programming ecosystem here in North Dakota. We need to find people that know us that we can now bring down and launch into those areas. And so like, for instance, like as we're launching Georgia now, find somebody that's been here involved with us, bring them down to launch it down in Georgia. And I'm realizing that's not the right mentality, right? Each region, each country has its own culture, philosophy, values, things like that. And so you really need to engage that local ecosystem to build this out with you. It's not like we can come in from the outside and say, here's what we're going to be doing from the top down. We need to build it up from the bottom up. And then the other one that I see is that I'm sure is very relevant for your work is just culturally how some of these things tie in and the speed. Japan has been a really interesting environment for me that I've been having some of these conversations with companies for multiple years. And now we're just starting to get to tangible things and it's so relationship focused and just the speed is so different than the US.
Yes, that's an excellent point. One thing that I see with companies that have success in international growth, they'll rally around something like 3M is innovation. And I think I've talked about another podcast is Disney is the kid within us. So it's something that resonates across all international cultures that you can rally around. Does Grand Farm have something like that when you're talking about retaining the culture of the organization, but also building it from the local ground up?
Yeah, that's a good philosophy that I hadn't really thought of. So I don't think we have a formal one, but what we are going to launch now that you're making me think about this is ultimately it's about identifying the challenges for that regional ecosystem and then pulling in solutions. So every region has its unique problem sets that they're facing, right? Some of the most expensive farmland in the world is in Japan because these farms are 5 to 10 acres since land is such a precious commodity there. The fact that the challenges they're facing is so different than the challenges our farmers in North Dakota that have 10,000 acres are facing.
So something like solving local farming challenges with technology. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yes, now languages. You're working with Japan. How are you handling the cross-cultural and cross-lingual communications?
We've really established some strong relationships with different consulates around the world. So like the Canadian consulate, we're like 2 hours from Canada. So that's a really easy one, obviously. But like Japan, it's been JETRO, which is the Japanese External Trade Office, has been really instrumental to us as we started this engagement with them. They've provided the initial translation services to kind of get this partnership off the ground. And so really it's kind of the local partners.
It's like local government resources.
Yeah.
That have been able to come in. Yeah, they're tremendous. Just in here in the United States, you've got the federal and the state resources that have connections all over the world to help companies get in. And I try to repeat this frequently because there's so many companies that don't realize that there are a lot of free resources out there to make introductions and help you launch. That's good that you've tapped into that. Have you had any funny challenges or difficult challenges across the languages so far? I mean, you've got people coming in that speak Spanish. You might have French speakers from Canada. You've got Japanese. Are you working through interpreters, or are you finding that the people in the farming space speak English, which I wouldn't guess? Or how are the conversations held?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been some translation issues, I guess you could say. Japan is a big one. We just hosted a big delegation last month. One of the things that we are seeing value in is that like these companies from around the world just want access into the US and to learn about US farming operations. So we kind of call ourselves a soft landing spot and like do test plots, get market traction, things like that, and learn about the local farming system. So there has been like just communication issues, not issues, but like, well, probably issues, I guess you could say, just from transition. Time zone is a big one. The biggest thing with Japan, especially as a parent of young kids, when it's convenient to meet with the Japanese is bedtime and family time. So usually a meeting at like 10 p.m. after the kids go to bed.
Yeah, that's difficult. That is one of the huge challenges. We have talked to people about if you do synchronous versus asynchronous communication, like how can you set it up? Like record a video of what you want to say to somebody, and then when it's convenient, they can respond to you in video. So you can use the demonstration, but there are times you have to talk with video and email and WhatsApp and all the forms that we have. Sometimes it takes a visit over, or it takes a phone call.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you said you had translators, people outside the industry don't know this. Translators is usually written and interpreting is spoken. So when you were talking about the translation, I was getting the feeling that you were talking about having somebody there to facilitate the conversation. So was it interpreters that they were pulling in?
Yeah,
They
it was
were. Okay.
Well, I
All
guess we
right.
relied on both. When I was in Japan last year, there was an interpreter that would travel with me to meet with these different groups.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I'm sure they gave you cultural hints and appropriate ways to do things and explaining things. Yeah, do you have any funny stories about that? Can you think of
Ooh, that's a good question.
or a fun experience from Japan? It's always fun to hear when
Yeah,
people
well, I mean, I
cross.
think the two things, one, business card etiquette in Japan is a real thing, as I'm sure you know.
I do, but tell me what happened.
Well, this is something I was coached on beforehand, but like I hate business cards. I always lose them. I'm like, just send me an email. And so the coaching was really when you give a business card, take two hands, bow, present it to them, hand it, and then they will do the same thing. And when you take the business card, you actually have to read it versus like what I do is I just like throw it in my pocket and then I eventually lose it.
Yes, yes. And so you found that you were doing that again and again?
Yes. And then through Jetro, I had translated business cards in Japanese, which everybody was very impressed. And then also like the importance of bringing trinkets and local snacks and things like that as kind of like a gift. And like, actually, this is a good story. So Fukaya City, I guess most communities there have an anime character. And so theirs is Fuka-chan, which is like a green onion kind of anime character. And so when I was there, I got like this little plush doll and I brought it back and my 3-year-old just fell in love with it. And then last month when we had the delegation here and announced the partnership with them, they brought 2 more Fuka-chans that were much bigger. So like almost the size of my 3-year-old. And the idea is that they're going to be moving out to our farm here and we'll have kind of like a little Fuka-chan chair, I guess you could say. But I will have to fight my 3-year-old to get it out of her bed because she sleeps with it every night.
Oh, that's so cute.
Yeah.
That's really a lovely story. And to have the 3-year-old really, because you never know what toys or stuffed animals they're gonna like. So that's really heartwarming.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
This is an audio, but there is a Japanese garden in Fargo here. So my 3-year-old Fuka-chan and I all made the trip down there to the Japanese garden, and it's just fun to like send these photos back to Deep Valley in Japan and saying, here's all these things that Fuka-chan is doing. And that's to me like what I get most excited about is these relationships. I'm much more interested in the relationship side of it than like the just business side of it, I guess you could say.
Right, and that's something that's certainly true for most countries outside of the US, is you're
Yeah,
building relationships and building trust rather than going in and just,
yeah,
can we do business together and then forming it and hoping that it works. Yeah,
yeah.
it's building that trust. Yeah, can you email me the picture and I'll put it in the show notes, so if anybody
Oh,
wants
yeah,
to see it?
absolutely.
Yeah, okay, that would be great. And so you've had a lot of successes in the short time. What do you wish you would have known a few years back when you came into this role and you were starting the international relations and working with people?
That's a good question. So my background is in media. I ran a publishing company here. So I was a journalism and a Spanish major. Actually, in college, I was going to be kind of a globetrotting journalist was kind of like the vision. So I've always been interested in kind of international, different cultures, traveling, things like that. So I think this just really excites me in this opportunity. And the biggest thing to me is I came from a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Everything needed to be focused on a ROI, business opportunities, sales, development, things like that, right? And, moving now into this kind of nonprofit ecosystem building role, it's much more focused on provide the value and then the finances will come to support that, right? So just give value and then the community will ultimately support you. And that's really how we've gotten all of it to where we're at now, right? We didn't start with some big check to launch Grand Farm and build it out. We started building out Grand Farm and then the checks started to come to support our work. And, that is one of the theories. It's going to be interesting to test how that model scales, right? Because we've built here with our local relationships, our local partners. And, the Midwest is a very kind and friendly place. And so how is that going to scale? That's what we're going to be testing.
Oh, good. Good. And so you are a nonprofit. So if there's anybody that's listening and they want to donate, then they can go straight to Grand Farm in Fargo, North Dakota and donate for
We,
all
we
the
would
initiatives you're doing.
we would
Okay.
never turn that down.
Also, pardon?
We
You
would
never.
never turn.
All right, if you send me the link, I'll put that in the show notes too, so we can make sure that you keep the funding for doing these great initiatives.
There we go.
When growing up international in ag research, and my father was in it, and then my son, who really didn't get to know my father, unfortunately, but he did ag research, and I'm thinking about all the sensors you were talking about. He was out in research plots as an undergrad at University of New Hampshire, like
Oh, wow.
counting the plants and the
Yeah.
stuff to do his research. So thinking about having acres and acres and trying to manage it and bring it down to a plant level, it's amazing to me. So maybe we will still be eating real food, not bioengineered food.
Agriculture is not going anywhere.
Yeah, thank goodness. So this question is coming. What's your favorite foreign word?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have been thinking about that, and I was a Spanish major, so I was thinking about going with one of those Spanish word originally, but then I started to just kind of think more about Japan. We're developing these really strong relationships there. And a word that I recently learned about that I kind of fell in love with is wabi sabi. And basically, it's a focus on the beauty of imperfection. And one of my great philosophies as a definitely not a perfectionist is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And so I would rather create activity, momentum, and energy than perfection.
Ah, that is wonderful. That is wonderful. And considering that you're building relationships and going out, yes, I think that's absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much. Any final recommendations for anybody doing global business?
I got to give a big shout out to our state trade office, the North Dakota Trade Office. They've been tremendous partners helping us think about this, educating, providing guidance as we're approaching this. So talk to your local trade office. Ours has been really tremendous. So I want to give them a big shout out.
I love the folks over there. I had the honor to come out in May and go to your World Trade Day and do a presentation out there. Got to know the people and just was so impressed with Fargo, North Dakota. And so if you're listening to this, and you have any interest in living in a cute town in a very agriculture area with great people, outside activities, and people who look very fit and healthy, definitely look at moving into Fargo, North Dakota, because that is one thing they were talking about, is they needed people to move out there to work in all the great things they have going on out there. So if I wasn't tied in here with my kids and my business and everything, I'd certainly consider it. So Fargo's great.
Well, that's great. I'm a big fan of it too. And then maybe I
Yeah.
will do just kind of a little plug for, we do have a number of events and programs and conferences. So we have an Autonomous Nation conference that's all around autonomy in agriculture. That's September 12th here in Fargo. We do a space agriculture conference with NASA, I think about the far future of agriculture. That's October 24th. So I can send you all those if it would be willing to put those in your show notes too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and any link that would show us all the upcoming. So if people are listening to it, past August 1st, 2024,
Sure.
when we're recording this, they can always go access to what events are going on.
Yeah, that'd be
So
great.
thank you so much for taking the time today, Andrew, for telling us all about Grand Farm. I'm really impressed with what you're doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Wendy. It was fun.
And listeners, I really appreciate you tuning into this. And I am sure that you know somebody that's in ag or ag tech, or somebody who likes to eat that might be interested in the future of farming. So pass this episode along and definitely give it a 5. And we'll catch you on the next show. Bye-bye.
That's a wrap for this session. A big thanks to you for listening to the Global Marketing Show. Hope you had just as much fun as I did. New sessions launch weekly on all places you find podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Google Play, and of course on our website. If you know someone interested in this topic, please tell them about us. Au revoir for now.